Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Refugee camps housing Syrians in Lebanon have suffered massive destruction because of the severe winter weather. That these refugees have been living in those camps to begin with since 2012 is symbolic, of course, of the lack of a political solution next door in Syria. Aid also is running out. And with an Arab League summit currently in session in Beirut, where poverty, amongst other such social issues across Arab League member states, is to be discussed as well. Will the Arab League or will other such organizations step up? Let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Professor Jamal Wakim, who is Professor of History and International Relations at the Lebanese University. He's joining us from Beirut, and we're also joined by Dr. Rasul, who is an analyst. He's joining us right here from Lahore. He's a Professor of Political Science at Lums University. Thank you both for joining us. Jamal, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you know about the situation right now in the refugee camps? From what's come out, it's quite dire, the situation.
Well, the refugees are living in very harsh conditions in the camps because these camps are not well equipped to face extreme weather, especially that in the Baqsh region, the temperature dropped to 0 degrees in some places. And the camps are not well heated, well equipped with medicine, especially with the shortage of international funds and supplies to these camps. That's why I believe that the conditions are not that good. But I don't believe that they reached an extreme hardship case yet, except for a few people.
And Dr. Rasul, you know, it's interesting, isn't it, whenever we're talking about refugees, specifically here we can talk about the Syrian refugees, it's always symbolic, isn't it, of the political crises in home countries. Why do you think there hasn't been more of an international effort to resolve that situation?
There have been efforts, but the problem is the character of civil war in Syria, which is along sectarian lines, although it started as a movement for democracy to end dynastic rule of Bashar al-Assad's family that is in 40th or 45th year. So it was a part of our upbringing. The people belonging to different faiths and classes wanted to bring about change through peaceful means, but then the Syrian regime suppressed protests, and there was a reaction, and then also extremist elements belonging to Daesh and Islamic State also dug in. And then ethnic factor, particularly when you talk about Kurds on the periphery of Syria, they also got involved into conflict. They liberated their own areas. They have problems with Turkey. So again, the repressive measures of the Syrian regime, which destroyed cities after cities, and did not care whether they were their own people, and did not treat actually the opposition at all as citizens of Syria, and did not bother about whether 70–80% of Syrian population became displaced internally and externally. And these people
is it fair? Do you think, if I may come in, Jamal, do you think it's fair to put all the blame on the Bashar al-Assad government for this case?
Well, I don't think so, because the case is very complicated, especially regarding the refugees in Lebanon. Most of these refugees first entered into Lebanon as legitimate, let's say, passengers who had work permits or who came for a visit, especially that the border was open between the two countries, and then they changed their status to refugees because of the situation in Syria. However, they got manipulated politically, first by Lebanese parties, whether those who are supporting Bashar al-Assad or Syria, and or those who are opposing or hostile to the Syrian regime and government. Because especially the anti-Syrian regime, Lebanese factions, wanted to use the refugees as a card against the stability in Syria on one hand, and they were pressured to do so by the United States and its allies on the other hand, and that's why, and the United Nations, and that's why there were no efforts made to help these people get repatriated to their country on one hand, and at the same time there were no effort to enhance or improve their situation in these camps or help those who want to go to Europe or North America to leave. So it's a very complicated matter, and we cannot lay the blame on one side alone. We need to see it from a multi-dimensional perspective.
Okay, so Rasul, we know that there are many countries that have different interests and different views about what has happened and what continues to happen there in Syria. But of course, at the end of the day, as you can appreciate, of course, there are human beings at the end of this who are suffering in some form or another. And we've already, of course, spoken about those in these Lebanese refugee camps, the Syrians there. Why isn't that pushing the international community to try to come to some sort of a resolution? Do you think, for example, the Arab League or other such organizations should step up?
And actually, no people have suffered so much as people of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan and recent history. And they have been the focus of external intervention as well as civil war. And not only there has been intervention from great powers, but also intervention from regional countries. So if you look at Syrian situation, it is very complex. Turkey is intervening. Iran has its forces there. Israel continues to strike Syrian targets. And then Arab coalition around Saudi Arabia has also been intervening and supporting resistance to Bashar al-Assad. I think it is a failure of Arab League. It is a failure of international power system that we have at the moment. And I don't think that leaders from within the regional states have risen to the occasion to address the problem of human sufferings in all these three countries. Syria is not alone. But Syria is actually more devastated than any other country. There has been rebuilding efforts, there has been peace, there has been normalcy now in Iraq. That is a great thing. But, when we look at human suffering, I think there are two things. One is the political settlement, which is necessary, without that refugees will not be resettled. The second is that wherever refugees live in Lebanon, Lebanon is not in a position to take care of all the refugees and their needs. Here is the role of the United Nations, great powers. They have been spending billions of dollars in providing arms to militants of all kinds. That is international powers as well as regional states. But why not to give money to these refugees to at least survive as human beings?
Okay, and that's a very good point, because I will pick up on that point that you just made there, Rasul Baksh, because that's an important one, isn't it, Jamal? When we're talking about the regional countries, and of course, as you know, Jamal, the Arab League is having a meeting right now in Beirut, I believe, a meeting of social and economic development, I believe. Do you believe that as Lebanon, and I know the Lebanese foreign minister has pushed for some sort of an understanding between these countries regarding the Syrian refugees, do you think that these countries should really now step up after all these years?
Now actually we need to admit the reality that most Arab countries have boycotted the summit because of the Lebanese stance insisting on reintegrating Syria into the Arab Summit or the Arab League on one hand, and on solving the problem of the Syrian refugees on the other hand. because the Arab League didn't get the consent of the United States and other world powers to reintegrate Syria into the Arab League or to solve the crisis politically. And that's why they freezed all steps that could fuse the situation in Lebanon. So this is a reality now. The representation of the Arab states in this summit is very low at the level of Minister of Foreign Affairs, and most Arab leaders have boycotted the summit because of the American pressure. So I believe that the refugee problem is much related to the final political solution in Syria. This is what the West is trying to do, and that's why they are obstructing any attempt to solve the situation based on bilateral relations between Syria and Lebanon or through the United Nations.
At this point in time, Jamal, what do you think the Lebanese stance is going to be coming forward? I know that Mishal is to bring some sort of the announced creation, of a structure to finance reconstruction of destroyed Arab countries on the final day of this summit. Do you think that that will succeed, that the Arab League will really agree to that?
The problem first is that the Arab states or the Arab League didn't get the green light from the United States, which has the biggest influence in the Arab world, to go for a political solution in Syria. And that's why reconstruction will be obstructed. And this is the reason why, for example, most Arab leaders were pressured by the United States not to attend the summit. So everything will be postponed till much later, especially that this year will be a year of escalation by the United States in Syria because they want to finish their mistakes before entering into negotiations with their foes, the Russians, the Iranians, or the Chinese over Syria. So that's why I don't believe that a let go will be given to the Lebanese government to take steps, especially that in Lebanon, the country is split between the president of the republic, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Hezbollah on one side, and the coalition of March 14th on the other side, which is much influenced by the United States and Saudi Arabia. And they are blocking any political attempt by the Lebanese authorities to approach Syrian authorities to solve the crisis of the refugees on one hand, or to take steps towards starting a reconstruction plan and setting the infrastructure needed for this reconstruction, especially that Beirut is well equipped to play the role of financial channel of international funds to Syria. So that's why the country is blocked, especially by March 14th coalition. And too bad we weren't able to form a government after 7 months of the legislative elections.
All right, so I'm just gonna come in, Jamal, and we have Rasul back with us. Rasul Baksh, I'm going to give you the final word then. How important is it for regional countries, or even countries themselves, within themselves, to overcome their divisions and to unite and to ensure that peace and security remains for all people throughout this region, that reconstruction occurs where there has been destruction, etc.?
I think this conflict of interest among regional countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran, is fundamental to the wars that are going on in the Middle East. And there has been no effort by either side to bridge the perceptual gap. They are deadly engaged in supporting groups within the region that are opposed to the influence of the other country. That is a major cause.
But I imagine, if Rasul Baksh, if I may, I imagine that the external factor, for example, we can talk about the U.S. factor here, or even the Israeli factor, and their influence plays a huge role here as well, doesn't it?
Certainly, that does play. But I think that is a part of the problem which is rooted in a conflict among the regional countries. And they have, I believe, a greater responsibility to settle their differences when it comes to conflicts in Yemen, conflicts in Syria, conflict in Iraq, and all these countries. And even Lebanon is not immune from their rivalry. Yeah, and it has been raging for decades now. And I mean, the external factors that you have mentioned, external powers, they basically exploit the situation that has been created by these two major countries within the region.
Okay, we'll leave there as a final word. We appreciate both of your times. That was Dr. Rauf, analyst speaking to us from Lahore, professor of political science at Lums University. We were also joined by Professor Jamal Wakim, professor of international relations, who's speaking to us from Beirut. He's a professor of history as well at the Lebanese University. Now, viewers, as both of our esteemed guests there spoke about, this issue of refugees obviously all goes back. The specific issue of refugees, that is Syrian refugees in Lebanon, goes back to the crisis in Syria itself, the fact that it has not yet been resolved, the various external powers seemingly fighting over influence in that country, whose mercenaries or groups that they support will win out, while the people, the Syrian people, continue to suffer either within the country or outside of its borders. We'll keep a very close eye on that dire situation of these Syrian refugees throughout this region and throughout the rest of the world as well here in The Scope. I'll be back with the next segment. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us here in The Scope, viewers. In this segment, we're going to discuss how on a visit to Pakistan, the leader of the United Nations General Assembly, the UNGA, Maria Espinosa, has praised Pakistan's hosting of Afghan refugees, saying its efforts must be compensated and recognized by the international community. She's also, along with Zalmay Khalilzad, the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghanistan reconciliation, they've both appreciated Pakistan's role in the Afghan peace process as well. This, of course, is all also then in context of the fact that Pakistan may, at some point in time soon, be hosting direct talks between the Taliban and the United States and other powers involved there in the Afghan peace process. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Dr. Hasan Askari, who is a political analyst, and he's joining us from right here in Lahore. Dr. Askari, thank you for joining us. What do you make, Dr. Askari, of the recognition that Pakistan is now getting, finally, I would add, for hosting these Afghan refugees, 3 million plus, and the fact that it has put in a lot of resources into supporting these people?
Well, the Afghan refugees were the largest community of refugees Pakistan has ever had. Even today, there are a very large number of Afghan refugees living in Pakistan. But since 1978-79, especially from 1980 onward, the refugees came and their number rose to over 3 lakh people at one and this same time. And most of the expenditure was done by Pakistan. It was partly contributed by United Nations Refugee Organization, that is United Nations High Commission for Refugees, World Food Program, and also WHO, World Health Organization. In addition to that, some of the countries also contributed funding for that purpose. However, all of that came to about 50% of the total expenditure that the refugee problem was creating for Pakistan. Right. And half of it was in this way borne by the government of Pakistan from its own resources.
When we talk about then, Dr. Askari, the entire Afghan issue to begin with, Maria Espinosa, as well as Zalmay Khalilzad, have praised Pakistan for for its handling and pushing for the Afghan peace process. Where do you feel that peace process is at this point in time?
Well, at this point of time, government of Pakistan is trying hard to facilitate a dialogue between the Afghan Taliban and the American representatives to evolve some kind of a political resolution of the conflict in Afghanistan. One session was held in Abu Dhabi, but subsequent meeting has not taken place. It seems that now that may be possible somewhere in the Middle East or in Pakistan, where Afghan Taliban and American government will talk to each other. The point for contention at this moment is that Pakistan and other countries, including United States, want that Taliban should also talk to the Kabul government. But the Taliban are hesitant at this stage. They want to talk to the U.S. first. Maybe at some later stage, the Kabul government may be involved in this kind of dialogue. So it's a waiting time, and hopefully the second round of the talks may take place soon, either in Pakistan or outside of Pakistan.
We know, Dr. Askari, that the Taliban is playing hardball at this point in time. As you know, there were initial reports that came out even in Pakistani media saying that there would be a meeting between the Taliban and Mr. Khalilzad in Islamabad itself during his trip. The Taliban has rejected that. Why do you think it is that the Taliban is being so tough at this point?
Well, I think the first problem is that Taliban includes a number of groups, and some of those groups are in favor of talks while others are not. So there is an internal political management problem for Taliban leadership. Therefore, they don't want to play soft. They don't want to create the impression that they are succumbing to the pressure of other countries, especially United States. And they are adopting this line of action, secondly, for another reason, that a good part of Afghanistan is under their direct or indirect control, so they feel confident that the Kabul government cannot succeed completely against them. Therefore, they are moving slowly. Thirdly, they think that the Americans would withdraw, and once they withdraw, it would be easy for Taliban to capture more areas in Afghanistan. However, America has given the indication that they would prefer a political arrangement before they withdraw partially or completely from Afghanistan.
Okay, Dr. Askari, I'm going to have to stay with us. We're just going to go into a very short break. Viewers, we'll be back with the rest of this topic. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, as we continue to talk about Afghan refugees in Pakistan, the recognition that Pakistan has now gotten for hosting those refugees, as well as how all of this plays out when it comes to the Afghan peace process as well. We're going to try, we're of course joined, as I said in the first segment, by Dr. Hasan Askari, who is a political analyst who's staying with us, and he's joining us from right here in Lahore. We're also going to try to speak to Qaisar Khan Afridi, who's a spokesperson for the UNHCR. He's joining us from Islamabad. Qaisar Khan, I'd like to start with you in this segment and ask you, how important do you think Maria Espinosa's statement was, recognizing Pakistan for hosting these 3+ million refugees, Afghan refugees that is, and for the burden that places on the country's infrastructure, resources, etc.?
Thank you so much. UNHCR acknowledge and appreciate the people and government of Pakistan for hosting Afghan refugees for nearly 4 decades in the spirit of Islamic values of hospitality and generosity. Yeah, in Pakistan, I mean, there are 1.4 million Afghan refugees currently residing in different provinces. In fact, we have initiated different projects. I mean, you have mentioned the burden. So we have this refugee affected and hosting area program for host, which was established in 2009 to help social cohesion and empowerment by improving livelihood in local economies, restoration of social services and infrastructure, and restoration of and improvement of the environment. So since 2009 to date, we have implemented around 4,400 projects in different areas, including health, education, water, sanitation, livelihood, and infrastructure. Some 11 million people have benefited from Rahab project worth $200 million. And 80% of the beneficiaries are Pakistanis and 20% are Afghan refugees. So we have this, like in 2012, the government of Pakistan and Iran, and Pakistan and UNHCR endorsed a solution strategy that includes like creating conditions conducive for voluntary repatriation through community-based investment in areas of high return, also building Afghan refugee capital based on livelihood opportunities in Pakistan, in Afghanistan to enable sustainable reintegration, and of course preserving protection space in host communities, including enhanced support for refugee hosting countries. So Pakistan is hosting Afghan refugees, and since 2002, UNHCR has facilitated the return of 4.4 million Afghan refugees, to their home country. In 2017, in February, the government had endorsed a strategy that includes 4 components, including flexible visa regime for different categories of Afghans, and documentation of undocumented Afghan national in Pakistan, and border management, of course, and the enactment of national refugee law. Pakistan doesn't have any refugee law, so the government has decided, in 2017, to enact refugee law. So these 4 components of this solution strategy this strategy was endorsed in 2017, and now we are following up with the government, and we are advocating that the return of refugees should be voluntary, with dignity and in safety. So UNHCR is supporting the government and doing advocacy from time to time.
Sarhan, do you think that that the international community as a whole understands the kind of burdens that hosting refugees places on host countries? As I cited in my earlier question, there are Lebanon hosting Syrian refugees, et cetera, et cetera. There are many such examples around the world. Do you think the international community does enough in that regard, and does there need to be more such recognition?
We try and get the international community to play there to support refugees and to support refugees in host countries, including Iran and Pakistan, and of course to provide development assistance in Afghanistan to ensure sustainable reintegration in Afghanistan. So, ultimate solution and political will for peace and security in Afghanistan should be there. Nobody wants to live away from their country. These are refugees. They have fled violence and persecution in their own country. So the international community, and we are advocating with the international community to provide support, targeted support in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan. So they are, playing their role, and Dr.
Askari, if you can, I just wanted to ask about, do you think that the international community understands the kind of burden hosting refugees places on a host country such as Pakistan, or in the case of Syrian refugees, Lebanon or Jordan? Do you think that that's something that the international community, A, understands, and B, if it does understand it, why does it not do more to support these countries?
Well, there is an understanding and appreciation of what Pakistan has done for Afghan refugees. The problem with the international system is that refugee problem has become so acute in different parts of the country different parts of the world, especially in the African continent, that it is not possible for United Nations to bear all the cost and all the expenses of refugee maintenance. And generally the principle is that it is partly shared by the host country, partly by the international agencies and donor groups as well as donor countries. They contribute to that. So that's the system that was also followed here in Pakistan.
Right. So Dr. Askari, I wonder, when we're talking then, if I may go back to the Afghan peace process for a moment, there's a flurry of diplomatic activity occurring right now on the part of the United States, especially, it seems, right now. And as you had correctly mentioned before, the U.S. wants some sort of a solution in place before it even thinks of withdrawing from Afghanistan. Do you think, though, that it can give up a bit of power in this case and hand over some of that power to regional countries such as Pakistan, who have been really looking for that sort of a role to take this peace process forward?
Well, I think at this stage, the only effort focuses on bringing Taliban and the Americans and ultimately the Kabul government on the table so that they can talk. At this stage, the U.S. As well as the Kabul government have not really disclosed what kind of offer they want to make. Some conditions have been put forward by the Afghan Taliban, and some responses are coming from the Americans. But what kind of political arrangement would be there, we don't know, because much also depends on what kind of political offer the Kabul government is going to make. Because if there is a political arrangement in Afghanistan, the present structure of the government will have to be modified to accommodate Taliban. And to what extent the present leadership in Kabul would be willing to do that, we don't know. So there's a lot of open questions at this stage. However, never in the past there was so much active diplomacy for finding solution of the Afghanistan
Indeed,
problem.
And if you allow me, Dr. Askari, I wanted to add voice to this conversation. We're also now joined by Dr. Ho Mabuhay, who is an international relations expert, and she's joining us from Karachi. Dr. Mabuhay, thanks for joining us and for taking your time out. What do you make, Dr. Mabuhay, of this flurry of diplomatic activity that is occurring in Islamabad, specifically with the United Nations General Assembly leader, in town in Islamabad, praising the country for hosting these Afghan refugees, asking for international recognition in that regard, and then obviously the Afghan peace process and Zalmay Khalilzad also in the country and praising Pakistan for its role in that process. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the optics are better than ever before. And like Professor Askari rightly said, that we've never seen this kind of active, proactive diplomatic footwork to achieve peace in Afghanistan in the past, which is also consensus-based. I think that's the biggest achievement because everybody, every state, every stakeholder is on board, including the United States of America, China, Russia, Afghan government, and the Taliban. So I think on the strategic front, that's a major breakthrough. But I see a lot of operational snags that this peace and reconciliation process is running into, which was expected. For example, I think there is a power struggle going on within the negotiation framework where the Afghan Taliban want to call the shots, set conditions for negotiations, and act from a position of power. On the other hand, the United States of America and other stakeholders are looking for some form of equity in the negotiations by asking for a ceasefire from the Taliban, which Taliban refused to adhere to, or asking the Taliban to speak to the Afghan government, something again the Afghan Taliban refused to agree to. So essentially what is coming across is that there are serious operational snags that are occurring, and it is normal when such contentious negotiations take place.
Right.
At this moment in time, I see the international community appreciating Pakistan for its role, Pakistan's full commitment to do what it can to achieve peace in Afghanistan. But this is a very, very tightrope walking exercise. Pakistan does not have complete control over the responses and reactions of the Taliban.
Yeah.
And neither can Pakistan be held responsible for it. So if any time during the course of these negotiations, as it progresses and these operational snags become real bottlenecks or road bumps that can't be overcome, and if Pakistan is blamed for it, the situation is going to become very, very tricky. And that is what I fear largely.
And Dr. Bakhai, if you allow me, because that's a very good point that you just made, if you allow me, I wanted to put that point to Dr. Askari as well. Dr. Bakhai there just brought up this point, and it's an important one, which I feel, when we're talking about the narrative around Pakistan and its role in the Afghan peace process. A lot of people in the international community speak about Pakistan as having complete influence and control, almost, if I may use that word, over the Afghan Taliban, but that's certainly not the case. So how dangerous and incorrect is that narrative, do you think?
I think this is a misleading impression that Pakistan somehow controls Taliban. Yes, it may have some goodwill with some Taliban groups, and some Taliban leadership may pay attention to Pakistan's advice. But there is no guarantee that the Taliban leadership will act in accordance with the wishes of Pakistan. They have their own agenda. The Afghan Taliban have been fighting for over 2 decades, and they have managed to survive. This also, gives them an identity. Secondly, within the Taliban movement, you have different groups. They also have problem of creating consensus amongst themselves so that the movement is not split. Therefore, there are pressures on them also. So it's a kind of a difficult diplomacy that Pakistan and some of the Arab countries like Saudi Arabia are persuading these Taliban, Afghan Taliban, to come to the table to discuss the political future of Afghanistan. And maybe Pakistan is able to facilitate such a meeting, but the solution cannot be guaranteed unless there are credible and reasonable offers made by the United States in the first instance, and then some credible offers from the Kabul government. And only then there may be a possibility of political settlement. At this stage, we can say that things are moving in the right direction, but we are not in a position to predict the outcome, the ultimate outcome of the current efforts.
Dr. Bakhai, Dr. Askari there said things are moving in the right direction. Certainly, the prospects look positive, but wouldn't it be correctly argued that we seem to be in a stalemate situation of some sort, where the Afghan Taliban are saying, listen, we're not going to directly talk to the Kabul government? And, a senior Taliban leader speaking to Pakistani media, in fact, made that very clear. So I'm wondering, how does one move beyond that very huge obstacle?
Well, I beg to differ from you. I don't think this is a stalemate situation.
Okay.
I think Taliban realize how the kind of stretch that they can actually exercise. The reason for that is that there is fatigue, there's war fatigue 360 degrees. And even the Taliban can't carry on this forever. And they realize that this opportunity where there is accommodation for them, political accommodation, this is a huge opportunity for the Taliban also. Because this is the first time where they've been recognized as a political stakeholder and maybe given an actual role in the future political setup of Afghanistan. That is the thrust of the peace, and it's called peace and reconciliation process. So I think that the Taliban completely realize that there is a limit to where the kind of push that they can give to the Americans and the Afghan government. The situation can actually go back to square one. The conflict has been going on for 17 years. So there is a very, very delicate choice that the Taliban have also got to make. They are negotiating from a position of power because of the kind of control they have on the ground and the fact that they control 70% of Afghanistan right now. but this is a golden opportunity for them to get a real, recognized, globally, internationally recognized role for themselves. And if they waste it away because they put in conditions that cannot be accepted and will not be accepted, will eventually result in a stalemate, and we will all go back to square one. And that will not just be unfortunate for the region and Afghanistan, but it will be also extremely unfortunate for the Taliban. So if there is some strategic thinking going on that side, it should accommodate the fact that this is an opportunity they should utilize to legitimize their standing in Afghanistan.
And that's a good point you brought up there at the end, Doctor, because I'm wondering, do you think, Dr. Bukhari, that the Afghan people themselves really will open up to having Taliban being part of any government? Because, I imagine that the Afghans would look at what the Taliban have done, and, the attacks continue certainly throughout the country. Can that sort of a group really be brought into governance and, be recognized in that way, do you think?
Taliban we should not even be talking to them with the kind of past they have.
Yeah.
And then there is the reality on the ground,
which
has compelled all powers, including United States of America, to recognize the ground reality. And the ground reality is that they control Afghanistan, and any progress is impossible without bringing them on board. Something that was recognized way before the Americans by the Chinese and the Russians, and perhaps even by the Afghan government. They offered unconditional talks to Taliban 2 years ago. So yes, this is not an ideal situation, but you work with reality, and that is what's happening right now. The international community is trying to work with the reality of Afghanistan.
Okay. So, Dr. Askari, I wanted to put the same question to you then. Do you think, and what do you think, Pakistan's view then is on the Taliban role in Afghanistan, in any future interim government, etc.? Do you think that Pakistan wants to be able to have a say in that regard, or do you think it wants to leave it up to the Afghans themselves to decide?
At the moment, Pakistan is not seeking a direct role in the future political arrangements in Afghanistan. Pakistan is simply facilitating. The Pakistan's interest is that there is some kind of political arrangement which results in stable internal peace in Afghanistan. In this connection, if Pakistan support, for example, material support, technological support is needed by the future joint Afghan Taliban and the Kabul government, then Pakistan would be forthcoming, but it will not seek any formal role. In fact, for that matter, no foreign country is expected to have a direct role. However, in addition to Pakistan, maybe China, Russia may set up a kind of a regional grouping that will help the new government, the post-settlement Afghan government, to deal with internal social and economic problems, and Pakistan may be part of that kind of advisory council rather than directly having role inside of Afghanistan.
Okay, so, just because of the history and how the U.S., especially this administration, has spoken about Pakistan when it comes to the Afghan issue, Dr. Askari, I'm wondering, do you think there's a bit of a deficit of trust right now between Pakistan and the United States in this specific regard? Do you think that the U.S. could tomorrow, for example, change its tune once again when it comes to, Pakistan's role in the Afghan peace process? Because, Pakistan's made it very clear that it's wanted a peace process from day one anyhow, and has wanted to be pushing for all of this that's now occurring from day one anyhow. Do you think that there is that deficit of trust, and how do you think that can be overcome?
Definitely there is a trust deficit between Pakistan and United States. For the time being, the American government has stopped public denunciation of Pakistan because they need Pakistani cooperation for bringing the Taliban to the conference table. If, let's assume for a minute that this effort does not succeed and Pakistan is unable to convince Taliban to come to talks with the Americans and the Kabul government, you will again see America going back to its old anti-Pakistan rhetoric and accusing Pakistan harboring Taliban and other elements that want to destabilize Afghanistan. So if the present effort fails, the relations between Pakistan and the U.S. can again go back in the troubled phase.
So then I imagine then naturally then Dr. Askari, Pakistan is looking to the likes of China, Russia, even Iran possibly as regional countries that should play an important role in the Afghan peace process. Am I correct to say that?
In the sense that Pakistan is also in touch with China, Russia and Iran, because these countries also wield some kind of influence on Taliban. So Pakistan wants all these states to come together to convince Taliban for a political arrangement. So that kind of issue is on the table. But what happens next is not very certain at this stage.
Okay, let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined with Mr. Ruslan Shah Mohammed, who is a former diplomat, in fact, and he's joining us from Peshawar. Mr. Mohammed, thanks for joining us here in the scope and for taking your time out to speak to us. What do you make, Mr. Mohammed, of this flurry of activity, diplomatic activity that is happening in Islamabad? We have the United Nations General Assembly leader, Maria Espinosa, in town there, praising Pakistan for hosting these Afghan refugees, asking for, worldwide recognition for that fact. And secondly, obviously also then talking about the Afghan peace process herself, as well as Zalmay Khalilzad appreciating Pakistan's efforts in that regard as well.
Well, this is there is a reappraisal of policy in America, and as a consequence of that, they have made now renewed efforts to kickstart the negotiations, and they've had already 3 sessions with Taliban. But now they're trying to exert pressure on Taliban to agree to a ceasefire. And for that, they have to pressurize Pakistan because they believe Pakistan still has some leverage with Taliban. Although Pakistan does not any longer exercise such influence as it had in the past, but still, because some Taliban leaders are going around Quetta area on the Pakistani soil from time to time, so Pakistan has some influence. Whether Pakistan would be able to convince or pressure the Taliban to resume negotiations also and to sit with the representatives of the Afghan government, which they have consistently refused for the last many, many years.
Yeah.
I do not believe there is going to be any fundamental change in the stance of the Taliban. They will not agree to hold talks with the Afghan government as long as the American government does not make any unequivocal statement with regard to their complete pullout within a time frame. Secondly, I do not believe that the American pressure on Pakistan to persuade the Taliban to agree to a ceasefire, that also is not going to work because the Taliban believe that if there is any ceasefire, their volunteers would lose motivation to fight. And inevitably, there could be a split also in the movement. So the Taliban believe this is not acceptable. So there are contentious issues.
Yeah.
I do not think that the Taliban or the American government are going to make any more concessions toward each other. But the problem is that the Afghan government itself is also to blame to an extent because the Afghan government believes that any reconciliation should not be at the expense of the regime in Kabul. They believe that any settlement has to be within the framework of the Afghan constitution of the Afghan governance system, which the Taliban, of course, refuse. The Taliban also are to blame for this, in part because they have not been able to convert their movement into a political organization, of which there is a manifesto, there is a program, there are goals and objectives, strategies, etc., so that people know what do they want and how do they want to achieve those objectives. So there are still considerable impediments in the way of reconciliation, and I think Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, China, they have to be on board, they have to be taken into confidence.
Right.
The regional powers have to agree to to guarantee any understanding that will be reached eventually between the Americans, the Afghan government, and the Taliban.
Very well. We're going to have to leave a final comment, but of course we appreciate all of our guests who have joined us for this segment. Let me thank firstly Dr. Hasan Askari, who's been speaking to us from the beginning of the segment. He's a political analyst and he was speaking to us from Lahore. We were also joined there by Mr. Ruslan Shah, former diplomat, who was speaking to us from Peshawar. Earlier we were joined by Dr. Ho Mabuhay, international relations expert, who was speaking to us from Karachi. And we were also earlier joined by Qaisar Khan Afridi, spokesperson of the UNHCR, who is speaking to us from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, firstly, of course, as we started off the program, we spoke about the appreciation, finally, that Pakistan seemingly is now receiving, at least by the United Nations General Assembly leader, Maria Espinosa, regarding the hosting of these 3+ million Afghan refugees and the burden that places on any host country. And beyond that, then, of course, we spoke about the Afghan peace process and the important role that Pakistan is playing in that. But then again, as all of our guests there said, there are limits to what Pakistan really can do. And the narrative about Pakistan's role in all of this in the international media needs to be corrected. And of course, the way that Pakistan is seen in that regard needs to be seen in a more realistic light. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation, but thanks for watching this edition of Scope. I've been Waqar Rizvi.